Good evening. Welcome to the first program in our summer forum series, exploring issues of race and racial justice. I'm sorry we actually can't meet in person and engage in a more interactive conversation this year. But you'll notice at the bottom of the web page where you are watching this presentation that there is information on how you can post questions or comments about tonight's discussion, and we certainly welcome you to do that. I'm really honored and pleased to welcome tonight's guest, Nikole Hannah-Jones. Nikole is a native of Waterloo and a graduate of West High School. She earned her undergraduate degrees in history and African American studies from the University of Notre Dame, and her master's degree in journalism from the University of North Carolina. She worked for several newspapers before coming to the staff of the New York Times in 2018. And she has been largely responsible there for developing the paper's 1619 project. So Nikole, I want to thank you for making time to participate in the forum. I know you're busy and you are much demand at venues much more important than this one. So we're really grateful for your time and your insight tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I take it in a general way that one of the goals of the 1619 project is to remember or recover or reassert into the American story, the American consciousness, the story of African Americans and their role in the development of American society. I wanted to start by asking you, when in your personal life did you discover that something important was missing in what you were being taught or what you had been taught about the American story?
Well, thank you, Dave, for hosting me. As I was telling you before we started, when my mom asked me to do it, I had to do it because I had to do what my mom says. And, you know, we met years ago when I was a member of St. John's Parish, which is the church that I grew up in, and all of my family is still in Waterloo, so happy to be able to take part in this today. Interestingly, when I first realized something was missing was as a student in Waterloo. When I was at West High School, our high school offered a one-semester Black Studies class. It was taught by Mr. Ray Dial. And in that class, that one semester, I learned more about the history and contributions of Black people than I had ever learned in my entire K-12 education. It was really transformative for me. And that class actually, while empowering me, also made me really angry because I wondered why no one had ever thought it was important for us to learn any of this before. I thought about how often I had felt demeaned by our curriculum because the curriculum really made it seem as if Black people had achieved nothing, contributed nothing, accomplished nothing except being enslaved and being freed and then Martin Luther King. And this class was an elective, so you weren't even required to take it. You could choose to take it or not. And it was actually in that class or after that class, I kept asking Mr. Dial to recommend more books for me to read. And one of the books he put in my hand was a book called Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. And that's when I first came across the date 1619. And it's called Before the Mayflower because it's referencing a ship, the White Lion, that lands in Virginia a year before the Mayflower. And that ship is a slave ship. And that's where the first Africans were sold into Virginia. And yet, every child has heard about the Mayflower. We think that that story is important to the American narrative. And no child was raised to learn about the White Lion, which came a year earlier. And I realized then that that was very intentional and that we hadn't been taught the whole history of America. And by not teaching that whole history, there's no way we could really understand our country.
So I didn't realize this, but actually kind of the roots of the 1619 project go all the way back to West High School.
They really do. It was that same class is what made me join my high school newspaper and put me on the path to becoming a journalist, and where I first heard about the year 1619. So I've been thinking about the year 1619 since probably around 1992 or 93.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what has been ignored or suppressed or misrepresented. I know we can't cover 300 years of history in a half hour, but what would you say are the main things that white Americans in particular don't know about this story? You don't know about slavery or its aftermath or Black experience in general. So I'll just give you some time. Take as much as you want to kind of hit what you think are the really critical things that we're ignorant about.
Yeah, so I'll just talk for the next 4 hours. Just kidding.
Okay.
But I think what's obvious is the main thing that we're not taught is how foundational slavery was to our independence and the country that we would become. The reason 1619 is so important is when you understand that the English landed Jamestown in 1607, and it takes just 12 years before we have introduced African slavery into the colonies. This is 150 years before we even decide that we want to become our own country and declare ourselves independent from England. If you understand that we only existed here for 12 years before slavery, then I think that shifts your understanding of how foundational slavery is to the country that would develop. We practiced slavery, racialized slavery for 150 years before the Declaration. Where we don't stop often to think about that many of the men who had the wealth and power to declare independence from the most powerful empire in the world at that time, which was Great Britain, had that wealth and power because of slavery, because they owned human beings and they forced those human beings to labor for them. So, George Washington, first president, Madison, who drafted the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the Declaration of Independence, all enslaved hundreds of human beings, and that's how they got their wealth. When we think about Thomas Jefferson drafting the Declaration, and these words are some of the most important words in the English language. Many of us can say those words without even having to look at a paper. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. As he's writing those words, 1/5 of the population in the 13 colonies is in slavery. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, owns hundreds of people, and actually brought one of the people he owned, who was the enslaved brother of his wife, to Philadelphia to write the words of the Declaration. So if we're taught history that way, then it troubles this narrative of our founding. It troubles this narrative of the country we want to believe that we are, because while we are putting these majestic ideas into the world, we are also depriving all liberty from 20% of the population. So when I think about how a history that really erases and downplays that truth, what that means is it's impossible for us then to understand why people are marching in the streets all over this country right now, that slavery was just as important to the idea of America as freedom, and that we held these two opposing ideas at the same time. And of course, 100 years after the Declaration, they would lead to the bloodiest war in the history of our nation, which is the Civil War, which is fought over whether we will be a country that is more slave or more free. Luckily for our country, those who wished the end of slavery won. But spending so much time really trying to obscure that hypocrisy, that paradox at our founding, I think has been really detrimental to our ability to fix the harms and address the harms that were done. And we can look now at who is in the White House right now, a man who ran really on a campaign of racial grievance, of stoking racial animosity. This is all the legacy of our inability to grapple with the truth of our founding.
Can you talk a little more about some of the other ramifications of that or consequences of that in our history?
Yeah, I mean, we have, you can look at what happens at the period of the Civil War. So again, we've really obscured what the war was about. We have obscured what role slavery played actually in the building of America as an economic system. One of the things that, of course, I hear a lot in my work as well, my family never owned slaves, so I don't have anything to do with that. But that's because we've been taught that the only people who profited from slavery were those who personally owned other human beings. But we have no industrial revolution in America without slavery. When we think about all of the textile mills that crop up on the northeastern coast, they're spinning cotton that is being grown by unfree people in the South. So even the Irish immigrant who comes over and makes his wage in the textile mill is making his wage off of slavery. We look at our financial systems. New York becomes the financial capital of the world because it is trading the commodity of cotton. And it is also ensuring the bodies of enslaved people. It is helping to produce mortgages on the bodies of enslaved people. The wheat farmer in Iowa is sending wheat products down to feed the enslaved people in the South because all of the land in the South is being used to grow slave-grown commodities like cotton and tobacco and indigo and rice. So it really was a national endeavor. And because we think about it as just a Southern thing, as just something that a small number of people profited from, then collectively we can't actually grapple with what it meant to be a country whose economic success was largely born on the backs of enslaved Black people. Then I think another important part of history that we really don't talk about is what happens at the end of slavery, that we have this very brief period called Reconstruction, which until recently, we weren't even taught about in your high school textbooks. And this period was where we really had a moment where we tried to address slavery and make up for it and make those wrongs right. And all across the South, you saw Black people elected to governance for the first time. You see the 14th Amendment, which if you are, if your ancestors were immigrants and you're a citizen, it's because of the 14th Amendment passed to ensure Black people's citizenship in their own country, the voting rights, the 15th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery. We see this real expansion in the idea of equality before the law coming out of slavery. But then it lasts 12 years, and we abandoned this idea that we could really make a multiracial democracy. And we spend the next 100 years in a country with legal discrimination, legal segregation, and really upheld by racial terrorism. So I also think the way that we're taught history is we're taught a little bit about slavery. There's the Civil War. And then you don't see Black people appear in history again until 1963 when Dr. King marches on Washington. So that entire 100 years in between doesn't even exist. And then there's this narrative of progress. So King marches on Washington, everyone gets civil rights, and then our work is done. That's clearly not the case. And I think that narrative that yes, we did some bad things, but we were mostly doing the right thing and we fixed everything that was broken, is how you have a place like Waterloo, which recently was listed one of the worst places in America to be Black, because there is a great deal of denial about the legacy of a country that for 350 years didn't believe that Black people were full citizens who were deserving of equal rights. And this is, my parents' generation. My father was born in 1945 into a country where it was legal to discriminate against Black people in every aspect of American life. So this isn't ancient history, but our inability to grapple with that means we are unable to grapple with his legacy, which is the vast inequality that we see in every community, including Waterloo.
This inability to grapple with that reality, or denial or repression of the fact that this country is based on this kind of fundamental conflict between freedom for some and not freedom for others,
Yes.
Is apparently, you would have to say, intentional, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so we don't tend to think about, even at the moment of our declaration, as, all of them being politicians. But they understand, the colonists who are declaring their independence from England understand that they need to make an argument. And the argument to the world is, we deserve to be free. England is enslaving us. They actually use the word saying that they are being treated as slaves by England, and that people have a right to govern themselves. England, of course, is also in a propaganda campaign against the or what would be the United States. And they're saying, well, you actually own human beings and you actually have people in slavery. So how can you argue that you are deserving of freedom when you don't allow 1/5 of your population freedom? And so what the colonists do is they work very hard to hide that hypocrisy. They draft a constitution that never mentions the word slavery, even as it protects slavery. Like, we all know about the 3/5 compromise, but if you read the 3/5 compromise, it never says anything. It does not mention the word slavery. And the first time that you see the word slavery in the Constitution is in the 13th Amendment, when it abolishes slavery. So the 13th Amendment mentions slavery to abolish an institution that the Constitution never mentions. So we know that there has long been a intentional cover-up of the role of slavery, how foundational slavery was. The colonists, as they're writing the Constitution, which is this liberatory document of freedom, they don't want to create a document that enshrine slavery. They understand that that is not the legacy that they want, but they're also not willing to get rid of slavery because their wealth depends upon it. So this, really, we've had a 400-year propaganda campaign to really downplay the role of slavery. And of course, it's been intentional. The way that we've been taught about the Civil War, the way that we haven't been taught about Reconstruction, the way that we've been taught about the Civil Rights Movement and the success of the Civil Rights Movement has all been because we are fundamentally uncomfortable. I always say that Black people are the most inconvenient people for the national narrative, because every moment that we want to glorify America, if you look at what is happening to Black people at the same time, it is often in contradiction. We think about, for instance, during World War II, we call that the greatest generation. But during World War II, Black people were fighting in a segregated military. They were going and fighting fascism abroad and then coming home and not being able to vote, being lynched for wearing their uniform in public, not having legal rights in their own country that they were fighting for abroad. So because of that, we often just don't deal with that history. It's very uncomfortable for us. It is contradictory to how we want to see ourselves. We are born with the notion of American exceptionalism. But when you point out their Black experience, we don't look so exceptional. And I think what's important is many white Americans in particular don't want to deal with this history because they don't want to feel guilty. It makes them feel bad. And I always say, no one is asking anyone to feel guilty about something that you did not personally do. But you have to acknowledge the legacy, and you have to acknowledge that whether you want to or not, you are a beneficiary of these systems. You are a beneficiary of a country founded on white supremacy. And it doesn't mean that you're a white supremacist. It doesn't mean that you agree with that. And you certainly don't have to feel personally guilty. But you do need to feel guilty about ignoring the blatant inequalities that we see right now, and trying to excuse them when we know that they were intentionally created from the founding of this country.
I'm guessing that in one way or another, people of color, Black Americans, have always been aware of this, okay, from early on, no doubt. When does this, or has this at all begun to actually dawn on white people that this is the truth that we have to confront? Is there a kind of a historical arc of awareness or not?
Yeah, for sure. So you're absolutely right, Dave. Black people have never had the luxury of seeing this country with rose-tinted glasses. As Thomas Jefferson was writing those universal words of freedom, we were enslaved. When Frederick Douglass was asked in the 50s to give a 4th of July speech, and his speech was what to the slave is the 4th of July, because his people were in bondage as we were celebrating this nation's independence. So that's always been the case. But what tends to happen is we're in a moment like that right now. Is you have these societal ruptures, these periods where something really egregious or brutal happens to Black Americans, and Black Americans take to the streets and protest. And then white Americans realize, well, things aren't actually as good as I thought they were. They realize that there is a problem, and really start to question then their country. And that's how we saw civil rights legislation get passed in the 1960s. And certainly we just experienced something like that with the murder of George Floyd. Black people being killed by the police is as old as our country, but when many white Americans saw what really can be described as nothing other than a lynching, this face down Black man begging for his life while a white police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And combined with Donald Trump being in the White House and really, in some ways, embracing openly racist platform, I think many white Americans have been jarred into questioning the narrative of progress that they felt when Barack Obama was elected to the presidency. We know when Obama was elected, I did stories about this. I interviewed people even in Iowa. There was a sense among many white Americans that we had reached the mountaintop, that if this country founded on slavery can elect a Black man, that we must be post-racial. I think many white Americans have been awakened from that notion with where we are right now. And what's encouraging is when I look at the protests all over the country, they're in all 50 states. So states with lots of Black people, states with no Black people. The protests are very multiracial in a way that they haven't been in the past. And they're also multi-generational. You see children and you see elderly people on canes, and they've been sustained. And we know that all over the country, books about racism are selling out. People are really wanting to read and understand how our country is at this point. And unfortunately, it often takes a really devastating tragedy to kind of wake white Americans from their reverie, but we're in one of those moments. And my hope is that we can actually not lose this moment and bring about some more lasting change.
Do you think it's just coincidental that the 1619 Project kind of coincides more or less with the whole awakening and the protest movement that we have seen since the death of George Floyd? Or do you want to take credit?
Yeah. I don't think any one person or any one project can take credit for the moment that we're in. But I do think that the project has helped people really make the connection to where we are now, that this is a very old legacy, and make those connections back to our foundation in a way that I hadn't seen in past protests. And one marker of that is how often I've seen the year 1619 referenced in the protests. We've seen it on signs. When they toppled the George Washington statue in Portland, they sprayed 1619 on him. They sprayed 1619 on the General Robert E. Lee statue. So I do think that the project has helped give these protests a lexicon to speak about how this is just part of an ongoing legacy. And to the extent that I've contributed to that understanding is deeply gratifying.
I think sometimes for us as white people, we can watch what we're seeing on TV and think these are isolated incidents here, there, wherever. And we really don't appreciate the fact that there is a whole historical narrative behind this, so that those folks who are out, people of color or white people who are protesting, are aware that it wasn't just George Floyd's death. There is a whole history, actually, a whole legacy, if you want to call it a legacy. It's kind of an awful legacy behind that. And your sense is that an awareness of the bigger picture really is emerging?
Yeah, it certainly feels like that. And I think that's the big difference. That's why in the past, when we've seen one of these police killings garner a lot of attention, Black people all over march in the streets because Black people understand it as part of a larger, as you said, system or legacy. We don't view these as incidents, individual incidents. But what is different now is, yes, I feel like white Americans are also starting to see and understand that this is part of a pattern, that this is part of a ongoing systemic issue. And that is why they are joining Black people in the streets, because when they only can see it as an individual incident, they don't really feel compelled to protest a larger system because they think it's just about those bad cops. Now I think they are feeling compelled to address a larger system that was largely invisible to them before, but is now much more visible, and understanding that it is a pattern. And that's really the only way that we can get fundamental change in this country, because Black people are only 13% of the population of the United States. On our own, we can't change laws, we can't change legislation, we can't change policy. We have to be able to convince a significant portion of white Americans and non-Black Americans that this is also critical. And that's the only thing that is heartening about what we're seeing now, is when you see the multiracial nature of the protest, then you start to believe that maybe it is possible to build this multiracial coalition that is necessary to pass the types of policies that will lead to fundamental change.
Is that, in terms of this a bigger picture, was that the failure of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, that this bigger narrative, this deeper truth was missing?
Well, I think the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s accomplished what it could. And what it accomplished is actually really remarkable when you consider my father was born into a world where it was legal to discriminate against the descendants of enslaved people in every aspect of American life. And by 1968, it was illegal to discriminate against Black people and other marginalized groups in any aspect of American life. That's huge in a country where that had been true for 350 years. But I think and I won't even call this a failure of the civil rights movement, it was a failure of our larger society, is we very quickly get tired and we decide, okay, that was hard, we've done enough, let's move on. And so at the end of the civil rights movement, we saw a white backlash and a retrenchment. Lyndon B. Johnson, who helped usher through the 3 landmark civil rights laws of the 1960s, declines to run again. And Richard Nixon runs on his Southern strategy, which is really coalesced around the racial grievance of white Americans who are opposed to this civil rights advances. And he wins election, and we start to see a rollback of those gains. And the other area that I think was a fundamental failure of that moment, though again, I wouldn't put that on the movement, is the inability to address economic justice. So before Dr. King was assassinated, he was really bemoaning that we've accomplished all of this legislation that integrates Black people into society, but does not address the fundamental lack of wealth that Black people had from 350 years of legal discrimination. So he's giving speeches before he dies, and he says, integrating lunch counters and giving Black people the right to vote didn't cause powerful people to give up a single thing. That the real struggle was going to be redistributing wealth so that Black Americans actually have a chance. And he says, what good is having the right to go to an integrated lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger? And that's really where we are right now, is Black people have legal rights to do anything that anyone else does. But Black families have 10 cents of wealth to every $1 that white families do. And the wealth gap between Black and white Americans has been literally unchanged since King's March on Washington. And that's, when we look at a place like Waterloo, so much of the disparity is the poverty, not just of income, but of wealth that Black Americans experience that keeps them locked into a permanent underclass. And what I hope in this moment is that we may get the will to finally address that as well.
Do you think that the fact that so much of the focus or awareness seems to come in terms of law enforcement right now, Is that a good thing, or is it just distracts us from the bigger issues?
Yeah, it's definitely my concern. I had a piece that came out in the New York Times Magazine last Sunday that is called "What is Owed," and it really makes that argument. Clearly, the focus on law enforcement is critical. When you are arming agents of the state and they have a legal right to use lethal force, we have to have accountability for that. And law enforcement is often the face of the institutions that make Black life hard. They're the ones who engage with these communities, and they have, weapons. They can kill you legally. So that accountability is absolutely critical. But I also think that's the easiest thing to focus on. It is easy to say, police shouldn't be able to kill you and there's no consequence. The much more challenging thing is, how do we actually create a more equitable society? It's issues like housing segregation, school segregation, very big issues in Waterloo. It's issues of lack of wealth and economic opportunity, very big issues in Waterloo and in places where Black people live all over the country. And I just haven't felt that that has been enough of the conversation if we're really talking about transformation. So yes, absolutely fix law enforcement, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. When it comes to what makes Black lives hard, what causes Black people to have lower life expectancies, to have lower economic outcomes, it's not police. And most of us are never going to be shot or killed by police, but the majority of Black people will be in neighborhoods that don't have opportunity and not have the economic ability to go into areas with more opportunity. And those are the larger issues and the much more difficult issues that we need to face.
We would be remiss if we didn't mention the other face of this story, and that's religion or churches. How do you see over this arc of history the role that particular Christian churches have played in creating the story, repressing the story, ignoring or denying the story?
Yeah, I think for much, if not all of this history, most churches have been on the wrong side of this. We all know that truism that Sunday is the most segregated time of the week for Americans, and that's still very true. When we look at Frederick Douglass, when we look at Dr. King, they reserve some of their hardest criticism for the church. That the church has allowed and maintained racial inequality and certainly hasn't been willing to fight racial inequality. But there are, of course, exceptions. And we know that there have been social justice churches. There's certainly a tradition of liberation theology within the Catholic Church. And I think that churches can and should be leaders when it comes to racial justice. I was always grateful to go to St. John's because St. John's was to me always seemed a church that actually did care about issues of social justice, not just in terms of race, but in terms of other areas. But I think that has been far too often the exception, and that clergy has not wanted to address these issues from the pulpit, nor in their community works. They have not wanted to necessarily stand on the lines with those who are seeking racial justice. And I think that is not living up to the duties and the mandate of Christian people. Though I'm the last person to speak on religion, but that's just my thoughts.
Okay. I wonder if you can imagine, let's say, a more or less average white middle-class person in Waterloo or anywhere who's listening to this conversation and saying, so what difference does this really make? It's all ancient history. Let's just move on.
Well, what I always say to that, and trust me, I get that question a lot, is nobody wants to move on more from this history than Black people. Black people suffer from this history. We're not holding on to this because it has somehow been beneficial to us, but you can't move on from something that you have not addressed. We have never addressed this legacy. People, the white middle class person in Waterloo can go to the East Side and they can see the results of this legacy. And they can see the suffering that this legacy has caused. They can see the great inequality. And what I hope people will do is imagine what a city like Waterloo could be if you decided you no longer were going to tolerate this legacy, that you were going to create a truly equal city where all children, regardless of their race, have an equal opportunity to accomplish their goals and live their dreams. This would be good for everyone. Our entire country would be better if we could purge ourselves from this legacy and make right what was done. It's not good to have such a vastly unequal community. It's not good to have entire sections of town that are written off by developers, that are written off by your top educators, that are written off by businesses. That's not healthy for any country or any community. And a lot of times, I think white Americans don't understand how they are impacted, but you are impacted as well. And you're impacted in ways, when you look at the white flight from the school district. Well, if you didn't have so much segregation and inequality, you wouldn't have a hard time keeping people in the schools. When you look at people leaving communities, this inequality drives out those who have an ability to leave, and it makes life harder for everyone who's left behind. I do really wish we would face up and own up to this history, make a commitment to try to make things right, understand that no one wants to be poor. No one wants to live in an unsafe neighborhood. No one wants their children to go to schools that don't function. People who struggle because they don't have money and resources, not because they don't want better for themselves. And if we agreed to that and began to work to fix that, we could build a country and a community that really lives up to the majestic ideals upon which we were founded. Because the ideals of this country are amazing. The practice has been lacking, but the ideals of who we could be are beautiful and majestic. But we just, we want to move on without making things right, and that's impossible.
I think I take your point of how impacted white people are by this story, because it seems to me that anytime you try to live a lie or you try to deny the truth, it has a really debilitating spiritual and emotional and psychological impact on an individual, and I think on a society. And in a way, it's kind of amazing that for almost 400 years, we have lived with this lie and somehow been able to keep suppressing the eroding effect that has on our own integrity and our own truthfulness, I think. Let me ask you about 1619. I know there's been some criticism. It seems, I'm not talking about the cranks and the crazy people, but from some historians. What do you take to be the main criticism of this way of looking at it, and how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think the main criticism is the main criticism is people think that I haven't given white Americans enough credit, that I was too harsh on some of our historical figures, our founders, Abraham Lincoln. And where that criticism was sincere, I certainly take it to heart. What I've learned is, we have a tremendous need to deify our founding, to believe that our founding was pure. And of course, my project is arguing that it wasn't pure, that these were human beings and not gods, and they had a lot of motivations and a lot of problems. And I guess, we were very explicit in that this project was trying to move the lens from of the picture from what had always been centered. And we were very explicit that this was a history from the bottom, This is a history from the margins. And I don't need to glorify Abraham Lincoln. We are raised every second of the day to understand Lincoln as the great emancipator. But that's not a nuanced and true and accurate picture. So I think that criticism came from historians who had a certain way of seeing the world, and their work told a certain story, and clearly we were pushing back against that. I do think on certain things, for instance, when I say that the revolution was fought in part over the preservation of slavery, in hindsight, I should have added more of the scholarship to explain how I came to that. I think that did leave me open to criticism, in that I know what I read and where I got it from, but I didn't make that clear in the piece. And of course, that would be an astounding thing for many Americans to read. So I think some of that was fair, and I also think if people understand the field of historiography, then they would know that historians are always arguing with each other. This is actually what the field is, that historians will write something and then 10 other historians will write papers about how they didn't get this quite right, or they didn't understand this certain thing, or they don't agree with that. So that was very normal, but for the regular public, they think, I mean, what I heard all the time is this, history is just history. And it's just the facts. And so you got it wrong. Well, no, people, history is interpreting the facts, and different people interpret them different ways. And I kind of fell in the middle of that as a journalist. So if we had gotten no criticism of a project that said, let's consider 1619 our true founding and Black Americans as our true founding fathers, I probably would have considered the project a failure. One, it was an evocative premise. It was one that I hoped would startle people and would make people really question what they had been taught. And one expects to get some criticism when you do something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And, you want to appeal as a prize, so that's some credibility.
Yeah, in the end, I think I'm okay.
Top of the mountain for a journalist, for sure. So, we kind of titled this, "Why Are Black Americans So Angry?" I want to kind of bring kind of some summary to that.
Yeah,
It's a whole long history.
Yeah, I mean, if this is the only country we've ever known. Unlike other groups, we don't have an immigration story of families leaving here to try to make their way. We don't even have our own last names. We don't know from which country in Africa or which people we came from. America is the only country we've ever known. And yet, from the moment we got here, we've had to struggle to get the basic rights and privileges that an immigrant from Europe would have automatically upon stepping foot on the shores. And to have spent, 300, 400 years in this country and still be fighting to be treated equally, I think anybody would be angry. When you look at the statistics, life expectancy, poverty rates, infant mortality, maternal mortality, income, wealth, incarceration, you go down the list, and the two groups who didn't choose to be part of America, which are Native people and Black people, are at the bottom of every indicator of well-being. Black Americans still face discrimination. When you look at social science research, when you look at data across every aspect of American life. And on top of that, law enforcement can seemingly kill us and not face a consequence. I think any human being, if that was your normative experience, would feel angry. A lot of times, white Americans say, well, it's been progress, right? When you've been in a country 400 years, you really don't care about notions of progress anymore. We should be treated equally. We should be full and equal citizens, and we shouldn't be continuing to mark progress when we've been here longer than most white Americans and most other groups. So that's why Black people are angry. Black people aren't asking for more rights. Black people aren't asking for special privileges. Black people are just asking to have the same opportunities and to be treated the same as every other group. And we haven't achieved that yet.
I hadn't thought to ask this question before, but it occurs to me now, as you refer to that and mention, other immigrants, some people of color and some not. Um, is it, what is unique about Black skin that makes this so difficult
Mm.
to,
I mean, there's nothing unique about it. It's
in our mindsets though?
yeah, it is
That
the
happens when we see a Black person that doesn't happen when we see an Italian who isn't exactly white, but you know what I'm saying?
yeah, it's called 400 years of conditioning. So I I write about this both in my 1619 essay and the What is Old essay that I just published, that slavery was first and foremost a system of economic exploitation. But you have to justify a brutal and barbaric system where you kidnap human beings, you transport them across the ocean, you buy and sell them on an auction block, and you work them to death. The justification for that became race. Europeans worked very hard, and even in the colonists, initially, Black enslaved people and white indentured servants and Native people were all kind of working together at the bottom of the hierarchy. And they planned a rebellion in the 1600s. And that is when the white elite decided we cannot have this multiracial coalition of people. We have to find a way to divide them. And this is when they really began to harden the idea that Black people were a distinct race from everyone else, that their skin marked them as slaves. And because they were not human like everyone else, you could do anything to them, buy and sell them, sell their children away, whip them, kill them, work them to death, and it wouldn't be morally or legally wrong. Once you have made that decision, generationally, that Black people are less human and more criminal and more barbaric than other people, once you've made that decision, when slavery ends, that conditioning doesn't just go away. It's still there. And we've never been able to purge ourselves of that because it was a justification for slavery. And then 100 years of Jim Crow that followed, which Jim Crow was also a system of economic exploitation. You can't overnight then say, actually, all of this that we've been taught, all of this that has been ingrained in our national memory for hundreds of years, it's actually not true. So white Americans, and not just white Americans, people who are not white, don't even have to think about this. It's just there. If I ask you to name 10 stereotypes about Black people, you could do it just like that. You know what they are. That is because we have been conditioned to believe that. And you have to be just as intentionally unconditioned over generations to purge that sense of thinking. And, we haven't really tried that hard.
That would be at the root of white supremacy too, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's what white supremacy is, right? That is saying that as a race of people, we are superior to you. We are worthy of legal protections, of dominating the class hierarchy, of all of the best opportunities. That is what white supremacy is. And we're not often taught it this way, but it was very explicit in the first few hundred years of our country. They wrote it in their documents. Thomas Jefferson wrote that white people are inferior and Black people are inferior. Abraham Lincoln believed that Black people were inferior. He believed in political equality, but not social equality. He believed slavery should end, but not that Black people should be treated equally to white people. So this is what white supremacy is. And we've never been able to completely purge ourselves of that ideology.
Do you think we are capable of it?
Yeah, we're capable of anything. I think the only thing that gives me peace when I read this history is if you understand that we created all of this, right? There is no such thing as race. Black people clearly are not inferior to other groups of people. If we understand that all of this was created, then we also understand that we can undo it, that we can create something else because it's not genetic, it's not predetermined, it's a choice. So yes, we can. Now, of course, saying, can we undo it and will we are two different things. And I don't know that we have the fortitude in this country to undo it, but we certainly could if we wanted to.
Okay. I really want to thank you for sharing your insight. I remember one time not too long ago, I asked a Black person to do some kind of a program, something like this. And he said, no, I'm so tired of trying to explain this to white people who don't listen and don't change.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate your patience and your willingness to one more time try to explain this. I hope sooner or later we are really beginning to, for the sake of our children as well as your children, to hear this and to do something about it. So thank you very much. And congratulations, by the way, on your Pulitzer, which is
so much.
A really big deal. And Waterloo is proud of you for that as well. But I think 1619 will be your legacy to America.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting these conversations.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
To those of you who are listening tonight, I just want to remind you that at the bottom of the web page where you have been watching this, there is a link to an evaluation form. It's important to us to have feedback from people about the programming that we do in the parishes. So if you click on there, it'll just take about 2 minutes to do the evaluation. There's also instructions there on how you could submit either a comment or a question to Nikole that I will pass on to her and hope that in due time she has a chance to respond. And we will post those on one of our web pages as well. And a reminder that next Thursday, Reverend Funches will be with us, and he will be talking about what white people don't understand about people of color. So thank you all for being with us. And Nikole, take care.
Thank you, you too.
I'll thank your mom for making you do this.
Okay, no, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.